Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar titled Accelerating the Generation of Payer Insights and Evidence Across the Product Lifecycle to Achieve Optimal Access. I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor for this event, Genesis Research, for making it all possible. Genesis Research provides agile, tech-enabled HEOR and RWE solutions to life science companies, providing them with a better way to develop impactful evidence and optimize market access. Market Access Transformation specializes in developing agile technology platforms that enable healthcare manufacturers to gather insights and access the commercial viability of their products. And recently, in May 2022, MAT became part of Genesis Research. Joining us today, we're fortunate to have two speakers. Dr. Preeti Jingaran is the Vice President of Evidence Strategy at Genesis Research, and Dr. Tiana Ignyatovich is the Director of Operations Team at Market Access Transformation. And now with that, I'm happy to bring Preeti on to join me. Hi, Preeti. Please take it away whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Sydney. Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for participating in the webinar this morning. For the next 40 minutes or so, Tiana and I are going to tag team and present to you the topic at hand. But before we get started, I wanted to take a moment and reflect back and share with you some of the thinking we had on our end in terms of why we even chose this topic of acceleration in evidence and insight generation. So here's the situation. So we live in a very dynamic healthcare environment across the globe, an environment which is creating a new world, a new paradigm for all of us. That requires, in this environment, speed matters. But what's even more important is generation of insights and evidence with speed and agility, but without compromising the scientific rigor. And that is what leads to acceleration of better care for our patients, because you're able to help the life sciences companies to successfully meet the evidence needs of regulators and the healthcare decision makers. So for today, we're going to focus on, one second, I'm trying to figure out how to, okay. Let's go back. We're going to focus on trends creating a new paradigm, and I'm going to touch just on a couple of them. Because of time constraints, I'm going to go really fast. We'll talk about how insights inform evidence strategy. Then we'll talk about technologies and processes which are available to us to accelerate the generation of insights and evidence. And finally, we'll take questions. Moving on. So when we talk about trends which are creating a new evidence paradigm, the first, which is most critical, is data. We now have novel data sources above and beyond the standard data sources which have already been available for decades to us. But the availability of these novel data sources really help us in answering research questions with much more granularity and precision. In addition to that, we have advanced data layering and integration methodologies. And that really expands the usability of data sources to answer these research questions. So because of all these advancements, you see an increased focus of real-world evidence in the pre- and the post-approval phases. You're also seeing use of evidence, real-world evidence, to augment clinical trial for regulatory and reimbursement processes. So let's look at where we see adoption of evidence and insights to support decision-making across the product life cycle. Then there are many examples here, but I've just picked a couple, which you see on the left-hand side of the screen. Insights and evidence have always been used to inform all the various different elements of a randomized trial, or in other words, your phase 3 program. In addition to that, more recently, we're seeing use of evidence and insights to contextualize and strengthen the regulatory label by building regulatory grade external control arms, which are then part of the submission package. Insights and evidence have always been used to understand patient needs from an unmet need and burden perspective. But now, with so many different data sources which are available to us, we're really able to focus on populations who are understudied, underserved, as well as look into information such as genomics, patient centric data. And lastly, reducing time to market both from a development and commercialization perspective. Evidence and insights have always been used in the past to make better decisions regarding what should be the target product profile, what should be your evidence development strategy, and commercialization strategy. If you look at the picture on the right hand side of your screen here, you see a summary of a survey done by Deloitte, which was recently published, where they spoke to senior execs from pharma. And the question at hand was, where is evidence being used to make decision making, to make decisions within the organization? And you see, based on the blue bars, which you see on the screen here, that evidence and insights are being used to realize to make decisions when it comes to labeling, target product profile, development strategy. I'm starting from the bottom of the screen here, but if you go all the way on the top, you see utilization of evidence more so in the future to inform external control arms, label revisions, adaptive trials, and tokenizing trial data to link to other real world evidence data sources. Now let's talk about the regulatory and the reimbursement agencies. From an FDA EMA perspective, the good thing is they're motivating life sciences companies to use real world evidence to augment the trial program. There are guidance in place. The FDA has data standards. And so life sciences companies have a better understanding of what will it take to augment the clinical trial with electronic medical records data, claims data, data from registries. The same thing applies to EMA. EMA has also established what's called a coordination center focused on data analysis and real world interrogation network called Darwin EU. It's going to be completely operational by 2014. And their focus will be to expand a catalog of data sources for use in registration of drugs and medicines. When it comes to the HTA frameworks, they also have encouraged life sciences companies to use evidence for many use cases. They have guidelines in place, and they essentially motivate the life sciences companies to use high quality, relevant evidence to reduce uncertainty and address the data gaps which exist. ICER, same thing in the US. One of the things which I found very fascinating is that ICER, as a part of their existing assessment framework, has indicated that in situations where the products come to the market through accelerated access, they're obviously coming to the market with a very limited data package. So ICER on their own plan to use real world effectiveness data to evaluate the effectiveness of the product once it's already approved. And they would do that in the 24 months post registration of the product. So they are investing time and resources to look into real world evidence to establish the comparative and the cost effectiveness of the product. So if you think about the regulators and payers, as you can see from the previous slides, which I just covered, all of them want to better understand what are the populations or subpopulations where an unmet need exists. What are the relevant comparators in the population where unmet need exists? And also, they want to focus on endpoints which are meaningful from a patient and a provider perspective. They want to take a little bit of a holistic view in terms of understanding what's the impact of utilization of these new medicines coming into market from a patient perspective. So, when it comes to getting insights and feedback from regulatory agencies, they've always given life sciences companies opportunities to engage with them at various different gate stages of drug development. However, the HTAs now, in the last decade, have started to offer opportunities to seek advice as well. In Europe, sometimes the advice is in partnership with the regulatory agencies so that you have a joint scientific advice. And the advice in early stages of development potentially focuses on the trial program. The focus is to get feedback input on the population of interest, the place in therapy for the product which is being evaluated, the comparators which are most relevant, and the outcomes both from a clinical and patient outcomes perspective. As you move on within the drug development process, you then start looking into all the arguments which are relevant and important from a value for money perspective. That's where your comparative and cost effectiveness analyses come in, where you might be looking at the framework which is being put for your models, the approach you're taking to extrapolate data from surrogate markers to markers which are meaningful from a clinical perspective. Now, when you're preparing for these scientific advice activities with the regulators and the reimbursement agencies, you need to prepare for that. And that's where the insight and the feedback, as you're preparing for these scientific advice activities, becomes really important because you want to put together the most relevant data package, which is going to resonate with them and seek advice and make it even better and tweak it even further. So as you can see that multiple trends already exist, which motivate life sciences companies to use insights and inform their evidence strategy. Now, what I'm going to show you here is how the integration of insights and evidence essentially facilitates efficiency across the product life cycle. And in my mind, this is my favorite slide in this deck. In my mind, insights inform evidence. Evidence in itself informs future evidence strategy, but it's an iterative process. And when you bake it or embed it in early stages of development and implement it all the way through the drug development activities, all the way through commercialization and post launch, that's where you're maximizing the likelihood of demonstrating value of the products. And by doing so, you're really increasing the reimbursement potential of the product from the very get-go and essentially implementing the right activities and evidence generation activities all throughout the process. Let's look at some examples. So here, I'm going to just illustrate, and these are just some examples in stages of development, which you would consider both from an insight and evidence generation perspective. This is not a comprehensive list. I'll pick on a couple. In early stages of development, where you are in phase 1 and phase 2, your focus is really in developing a target product profile. Your focus is also to understand all the various different elements of the phase 3 program. In both of these, the primary topic of interest is what is that minimum efficacy estimate which is needed for a reimbursable asset. That requires feedback. You require feedback to prepare for your scientific advice. You want to understand the perceptions and the perspectives of the healthcare decision makers, the regulators, and that helps you prepare for these early advice sessions with the regulators as well as the reimbursement agencies. As you move on, now you're in phase 3. You have a product which has been probably gone through commit to phase 3 since the product is already in phase 3. You've started to build and put the blocks in place in early stages of development. Now you're tightening your evidence package. And just to take an example, when we're building the value story of the product and you have the various different elements, such as unmet need, burden, prevalence, place in therapy, the economic value, and the clinical value, and you're stringing it all together to build your value proposition and value story, you need to test it. You need to test it from a value messages perspective, and then you need to refine it. That's where insights and evidence go hand in hand in any stage. But nonetheless, as you get to phase three, you're really tightening the value story and the value proposition of the product. In addition to that, you're also tightening your phase three program before it gets locked. And you want to make sure that the HTA and regulatory needs of the program are embedded within your phase three program. That requires insight. And lastly, as you go into phase four, you have launched the product with excellence. You now want to make sure that you are able to sustain the trajectory, which you've been able to establish at the time of launch, and generate real world effectiveness. With the generation of the real world effectiveness, you also are focusing on a differentiation strategy. Where do you need to generate head-to-head data? Do you need to generate head-to-head data? That requires pair input in terms of building that differentiation strategy. So I just wanted to give you some examples of where insights and evidence activities are needed across the product lifecycle. Of course, there are many, many more examples to illustrate the point of how insights, when embedded in the generation of evidence and building of the evidence package, really kind of change the game, because you're bringing products and data package which are going to resonate with the healthcare decision makers. So we talked about insights and evidence, but we didn't touch upon acceleration so far. Now we're going to focus on what are the technologies and processes which are available to us to accelerate the generation of insights and evidence. So here, this is where we're going to talk about Genesis research. So when talking about Genesis research, I'm going to share with you some of the nuggets, but of course, there's a lot of information on this slide here. I guess we wanted to tell you a whole lot more about Genesis research, but I'll touch on some of the salient points. So founded in 2019, based in Hoboken, we're about 200 plus employees across the world. Genesis Research is a leading evidence generation partner for our life sciences industries, and our focus is on end-to-end evidence support across all the pillars of evidence, which includes strategy, generation, optimization, and communication, as you can see on the right-hand side of your screen. Now, I wish I could tell you more about all the offerings across all the elements of evidence, but please feel free to contact us if you need to find out more about what's included in strategy, generation, optimization, and communication. But what makes Genesis Research different? And that's the fit for purpose partnership model, where you're putting flexible integrated teams, which are multidisciplinary in nature, totally customized to the needs of the clients. And it's at the engagement level, not at the project level for the most part, where you're working with the clients on multiple different activities, which could range anywhere from strategy build all the way up to execution, optimization, and communication. So the idea here is that firstly, you are understanding the client needs and putting this multidisciplinary team in place, which supports the client's needs. On top of that, we have the thought leadership and the subject matter expertise. Overlaid on top of that engagement model is what results in the acceleration of evidence generation. Firstly, by having that thought leadership, you bring in scientific excellence, you bring in operational excellence because of the partnership model, and you bring in execution excellence because we can pivot very quickly and go from one thing to another without any paperwork, without any contracting adjustments which are needed. So here, this engagement model, along with thought leadership and scientific excellence, is what results in acceleration and agility and flexibility, which is needed to execute evidence with excellence and speed.
Let me first introduce you to Market Access Transformation, or MAT. Since it was founded, MAT has been transforming the way payer insights are generated through a tech-enabled approach via its Rapid Payer Response, or RPR, platform. MAT delivers payer insights when needed in as little as 5 days. The research is conducted in a still double-blinded manner. And while the RPR platform allows a very efficient online aggregation of payer responses, it is not a static, one-way, one-off payer engagement. It enables dynamic re-engagement with the same set of respondents through clarifying or follow-up questions. MIT's team of consultants also supports our clients in developing the survey materials so that they are both asking questions in a payer-relevant manner, as well as addressing key business questions at hand. We also analyze all the responses that come in and provide in-depth insight reports that contain actionable recommendations for our clients. And all of this is delivered via a 1-year credit-based subscription model that facilitates lots of the contracting processes. So if you look at the traditional way to engage with payers, the traditional approach takes around 3 to 4 months from start to finish to account for the contracting period, the time to recruit the payers, to execute interviews, and then analyze all the responses. With the MAT's approach, that time is contracted to as little as 2 to 3 weeks. And this is via utilization of a very efficient aggregation of payer responses while maintaining robustness of the research and allowing agile re-engagement with the payers. We are now going to have a look at some real-life examples of where this agile and rapid engagement with the payers was used to augment the evidence generation plans. In this first example, a large biopharma client requested MAT support to gather payer insights for their early asset profile. This asset was considered in an increasingly competitive landscape or market for an autoimmune disease. The asset had a new, more selective mechanism of action, which the client believed would deliver superior efficacy and safety results and would become a market leader. The company didn't have an extensive presence in this market, and given that this asset was a few years out from launch, they also wanted MIT support to understand what would be the key value drivers for payers in this indication in the future. So with these business questions in mind, MIT conducted a survey with payers across 7 scope markets of interest listed here on the slide, with the objectives of firstly understanding the key value drivers in the indication, bearing in mind this future competitive landscape. Second, to assess the payer perceptions of the early target product profile, and importantly, understand how well it performs on those identified desired attributes from the payers. And consequently, really understand if there are any evidence gaps that the manufacturer should factor in the evidence generation strategy. So we conducted this research, and the insight report was delivered in 3 weeks. And what we found is that while the payers appreciated the strong performance in those key established efficacy endpoints for this asset, that really wasn't sufficient going forward to be seen as fully differentiated given this competitive future landscape. The changes in the landscape with multiple different mechanisms of action competing, all with pushing the bar upward, was necessitating differentiation beyond the traditional efficacy endpoints to achieve the kind of price that the manufacturer was targeting. And it was the patient-reported outcomes and quality of life metrics that were identified as the key emerging value drivers in this indication. And this was something that the manufacturer, the sponsor of the research, hadn't really previously believed was worth significant investment, because they felt the clinical differentiation from the traditional efficacy endpoints was quite strong. One of MIT's key recommendations here was to revise the evidence generation strategy and really provide more of focus on to the PROs. But the next question that was identified was the need to understand which PRO domains were most payer relevant and which instruments should be utilized to capture that impact. So that was the focus of the follow-up survey, which we conducted within 2 weeks of the first readout, while this topic was still fresh in respondents' minds. And the second survey identified that out of the different PRO domains, the impact on physical functioning, specifically signs and symptoms, was most relevant from the payer perspective, as it was supporting the data that would be available on the established efficacy endpoints. Second, impact on daily activities of life was seen as both patient and payer relevant. In contrast, any impact on psychosocial functioning was seen as less payer relevant and was seen as more subjective in terms of the measurement. The follow-up survey also looked at what instruments would be most acceptable to capture these outcomes, and we found that out of the multiple instruments we tested, there was some divergence across the scope markets. However, we were able to identify 2 instruments which, if used in conjunction, would maximize the PMA outcomes globally for this client. So what I want to summarize and highlight as the takeaways from this example is that it illustrates how payer feedback was utilized early on in the product development cycle to understand whether an asset with an early profile is reimbursable and whether it can achieve a price potential that was anticipated or desired. Secondly, the ability to re-engage with the payers allowed us to dig deeper into the evidence gaps that were identified, understand how to fill them so that the company could achieve the target price. And thirdly, all of this research was delivered on fairly accelerated timelines to meet the client's internal milestones. In this next example, we'll be looking at how rapid payer feedback was utilized to inform registrational trial design, and also how to identify areas of focus for the HTA scientific advice ahead of protocol lock. In this example, the asset was further along in the development life cycle. It was a phase 2 asset investigated in multiple different indications, but one of the follow-on indication was non-small cell lung cancer, which was the focus of this survey. The client had proposed a study design which was fairly complex. It had anticipated utilizing multiple combinations of therapies, several different patient subpopulations, and subgroup analyses. And they were facing a critical deadline for HTA advice meeting for registrational trial discussions. So with these set of business objectives in mind, MIT conducted the survey with payers across 7 slightly different markets versus the previous survey. And the focus here was really to conduct a very detailed vetting of the trial design parameters. So looking at both endpoints, the trial inclusion/exclusion criteria, comparators, but also stratification factors, and really look out for any red flags from the access perspective. The survey also tested the payer perception of the associated target product profile and looked at price implications in an indication expansion scenario. And finally, given the dynamism of this indication, we looked whether competing agents' trial designs could also factor in how payers perceive this asset. So within the 3 weeks of fielding, an insights report was delivered. And what it found in this case that payers did appreciate the ambitious and pragmatic trial design. However, the findings really flagged multiple access risks that were largely stemming from challenges interpreting such a complex study design. There was a need for multiple subgroup analysis and really a risk of diluting the treatment effect from this trial design. In addition, given the complexity of this indication, the chosen comparator was seen as suboptimal, looking at the multiple markets of focus. And this is resulting from the differences in the reimbursement conditions and resulting prescribing practices. Now, while indirect treatment comparisons were one of the identified mitigation strategies, the payer research also flagged that in this situation, there were many risks and challenges in really delivering ITCs which were sufficiently robust. What the survey also found is that this proposed study design hampered the HTA outcomes and had raised the risk of substantial price erosion for the asset in this indication expansion scenario, and that had significant commercial implications across the product lifecycle. Based on the totality of the survey findings, one of the key MIT's recommendations for the clients was really to revise the trial design. And based on payer feedback, we proposed 3 alternative study designs. Some of the changes included focusing on a more narrow patient subgroup with worse prognosis, changing the trial arm design, and also rethinking the comparator to include physician choice of therapy as well. These alternative study designs were vetted and checked by the client's clinical medical teams and were then retested with payers within 2 weeks of the first readout. What the second survey was able to identify was the preferred trial designs per each market in scope, and there was some divergence in preference. However, by factoring in also the price potential and the volume potential for each market, MIT was able to recommend to the client one trial design to focus on for the clinical development and also to focus on during HTA scientific advice. So the 3 points I want to highlight from this case study is that, firstly, in this situation, rapid and agile payer feedback was utilized to allow the client to revise their pivotal trial design to prevent any access hurdles further down the line. Secondly, MIT's fast turnaround timelines allowed the client not just to pivot, but to retest their revised evidence generation strategy. And lastly, it also enabled the client to maximize their engagement during HTA scientific advice. We know that this time is very precious, so this enabled more effective engagement on that occasion. These 2 examples we've gone through now are just snippets of multiple different situations where MIT can support the revision or testing of the different evidence generation strategies, but hopefully give you a flavor of why this approach is valuable, really in augmenting the evidence generation plans. I'm now going to hand the rest of this webinar presentation back to Preeti, who will discuss some further real-life examples.
Thank you, Tiana. All right, so let's move on and talk about some additional case studies here. All right, so yet another case study. So in this situation, a clinical stage life sciences company requested support across multiple assets within their portfolio. These assets were in the oncology space on a proprietary platform. The most immediate need which our client had was to really provide rapid and time-sensitive integration and input into their trial design from a payer perspective. Their phase 3 program was going to be locked in about 3+ months, so we had limited time to make adjustments to their evidence strategy, including the phase 3 program. In addition to that, they requested Genesis Research to build an integrated evidence generation strategy, including HEOR activities across both of their assets, which they had in their portfolio. The first asset was an alliance with yet another large pharma. The second asset was something they were going to be independently developing and commercializing. Now, this company did not have experience in commercialization, hence, they were really looking for that thought leadership and scientific input to integrate pair and HTA evidence needs into their evidence package. So first, from an approach perspective, we rapidly integrated into the client's cross-functional team. If you remember early on, we talked about these multidisciplinary teams, which were fit for purpose based on the client's request and client's problem at hand. In these situations, once the team was put in place with thought leadership as well as scientific expertise, the most immediate need was to really deploy evidence synthesis work, HTA analog work, as well as strategic insights which could be gained from already published trials in this space. The combination of all of this, as well as the experience from a thought leadership perspective, really led to the adjustments in the phase 3 program. I'm going to elaborate on a couple of things in a few minutes. I do want to emphasize the point that in 2022, when the engagement started, and we're still working with the client, the focus was more on strategy build with the support of evidence synthesis and RWE analytics. As we move into 2023, we'll be focusing more on the execution of the strategy, which now has been put in place. Now let's go back to the phase 3 program, which certainly was adjusted based on the input and feedback we were able to provide. The question at hand in this situation was to really enrich the target patient population, which was being included in the phase 3 program. They wanted to exclude patients who were non-responders. And from that perspective, they wanted to focus on patients who had resistance, primary resistance. The problem was there was no definition or consensus around the definition of primary resistance. So that is where we relied on already published trials, evidence synthesis, as well as the HTA analog, which I just mentioned, and the collective understanding based on all the work which was done from a due diligence perspective helped us understand what that empirical definition could be for primary resistance. And the idea here was to tweak the exclusion criteria, which was being included in the phase 3 program. We were able to make a strong scientific as well as business case in terms of which patients should absolutely be included from the phase 3 program. And by doing so and adopting the recommendation which was made, we increase the potential or the viability of having optimal access. The one additional thing which is worth mentioning is that we were able to influence the clinical development team in terms of moving the patient-reported outcomes higher in the hierarchy from a statistical analysis perspective. In the oncology space, as you know, oftentimes within trials, you're using surrogate markers like progression-free survival. In that case, when you have PRO plus PFS data, that provides a much more holistic view in terms of the impact of the intervention or the drug on the endpoints which are meaningful to the patient and the provider. So by moving the PROs in the hierarchy, you increase the likelihood of having the PRO within the label, even if it's in the clinical trial section. And from that perspective, now the organization, should the PRO be included in the clinical section of the label, they will be able to talk about not just their primary efficacy endpoint, but also the PROs, which were included within the trial. And lastly, we were able to make a strong case in terms of why healthcare resource use analysis should be embedded in trials. As we all know, oftentimes it is not, but we made a strong business case as to why it should be included in the trial. I mentioned the comprehensive integrated evidence strategy, which was requested for both of the assets which were in their portfolio. As I mentioned earlier, that evidence strategy has been put in place, and we have plans to develop and test those strategies using MAT RPR platform. And we're in the process of preparing for an early scientific advice. In 2023, as you can see from the pie chart on the left-hand side, the focus is going to be in terms of generation of these RW activities, which are part of the plan. But in addition to that, we've already started to build an early economic model, which helps them justify what is an economically justified price and what is that efficacy differentiation which you would need to establish that economically justified price. Let's move on to the last case study. All right, in this situation, this was a mid-sized life sciences company which was requesting strategic and tactical support. They also had two assets in development. One was a small molecule, first in class, that was granted orphan drug designation. And the second one was a novel treatment for rare disorder. Both of these assets continue to be in phase 3. I'm going to focus for the most part on the first asset, the small molecule asset. The need here was essentially to help the organization for all the launch readiness activities. They had a comprehensive evidence package which had to be executed. They needed to support the build of the value proposition and value development. And they also had the need to have these real-world evidence activities be published in peer-reviewed journals. And for those of us who've supported launch readiness activities, you know that you have multiple different work streams. There's a sense of urgency across all of them. So when it comes to launch readiness tactics, tools and resources which you have to build to support the launch with excellence, there's lots of moving parts, and it requires a lot of effort and time and resources to pull it all together. So the approach we took was, firstly, we supported the client to do SLRs and TLRs, or targeted lit reviews, or systematic lit reviews, to support the value story and value proposition build. Secondly, multiple real-world analytics activities were put in place to support the launch readiness activities. One of the key things which I wanted to highlight in here, in this case, was the need for having a patient algorithm for identification perspective, which could be implemented in claims. So Genesis Research was instrumental in pulling together this novel patient identification algorithm. There was also a need, while pulling all this information together, to do rapid analytics work, because there was an adjustment which had to be done based on their readout from the phase 3 program. That required us to pivot very quickly with a sense of urgency to make some adjustments and build an adjusted RWE analytics and evidence package. As I mentioned earlier, there was a need to have all this information which was being generated to be out in peer-reviewed journals. And again, when you launch an asset, you have the elements of your value story, value development already in the public domain in peer-reviewed scientific journals, it makes your life easier. So we were able to essentially develop 8+ publications and put it out for peer-reviewed. Many of them have already been published. So hopefully this helps you understand the end-to-end support which Genesis Research can provide, which ranges all the way from strategy to synthesis to communication, as well as optimization. And this would be a perfect example of when you need different and disparate type of support for launch readiness or other activities. Now, if you remember from the previous slide I had, that there was another asset which they had in their portfolio, which was in earlier stages. And I haven't spent too much time on that, but I did want to to highlight that we're in the process of pulling together the evidence package for that asset. And the next step for us is to really help the life sciences company for an early strategic a scientific advice activity with the HTAs. And as a part of that activity, there's a lot of different elements we're focusing on. Some of them include really operationalizing the efficacy endpoint based on empirical data, understanding how to optimize the background therapy and what would be acceptable in this space, and lastly, minimization of drug wastage. So last slide here, I wanted to just highlight and close this session. So in summary, hopefully Tiana and I have been able to make a strong case in terms of why life sciences companies should take a life cycle approach to insight and evidence generation that begin in early stages of development. You saw that the generation of evidence and insights is an iterative process, and when done well from early stages, it could be game-changing because it brings in efficiency and effectiveness from a development and commercialization perspective. And lastly, agile partnerships, such as the ones with Genesis Research and MAT, RPR, really provide the ammunition to bring in the acceleration and optimization of insight and evidence generation. We want to thank you for your time, and I think we have probably about 10 minutes to take some questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, both of you, for those fantastic presentations. Let's dive right in and start taking some audience questions. Our first one here is from Mohammed. Does MAT have any experience of testing RWE strategy / study design with pairs?
Okay, thanks, Mohammed and Sydney. So that's an interesting question. In the previous, in her initial presentation, part of the presentation, Preeti was discussing the growing importance of real-world evidence and also the growing interest from the manufacturers. So in fact, we've had lots of more interest in the recent years and activity within the segment. And the type of work we've done in the real-world evidence space has been very varied. So it included more landscape type work in just terms of understanding how payers see real-world evidence, how they utilize it, and really the acceptance, because this is a fast-moving field, or being much more going into much more specifics around what type of study design should be utilized to augment either a pre-launch product or at launched, maybe in situations where it's a single-arm trial, so using synthetic control arms through real-world evidence, or for launched products in looking at how post-marketing real-world evidence can augment the differentiation, particularly where there's no head-to-head data. So yes, we've had multiple different types of surveys we've been involved within this area, and it's just really very important.
Okay, great response, thanks. Our next question, Stephanie asks, how do you determine data available or possible data sources for a disease state?
I could take that question. Here in Genesis Research, firstly, we're a data agnostic company. We work across multiple different data sources. So when we have a question at hand, we try to do a data landscape to understand what would be the best data sources to answer the research question. As you know, when you work with big pharma, they have a lot of data available through their platforms. In other instances, we would go into the literature to better understand what would be the best data sources to answer the question. Sometimes it also requires us to do some feasibility work early on to really pin down the appropriate data source which should be used to answer that question. It's very disease dependent. Every data source has limitations and strengths. So it's really very important to understand what is the disease state, what is the question at hand, and what would be the best data source to answer the question.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. Okay, our next question is from Lee. Given that payer insights are collected via an online platform, can they be as robust as telephone interviews where the interviewer can probe and change direction course?
I think this is relating to MIT, so maybe I can take this one. So yes, MIT has an online payer engagement platform. However, as I've said before, it's not a static engagement. It's not some kind of survey monkey. Payers writes short answer, multiple choice questions, and there they go. It's we have the MIT draws on the experience of first structuring the questions in a way that really utilize the most appropriate approach to answer the question at hand. Also, the payers who work with us know also what's expected in terms of the depth of the response, so we can get that robustness. But also we have that dynamic ability to re-engage with the payers in case there is something that's not clear, or if there's totally new avenues worth exploring to ask follow-up questions. And another advantage of the online approach specifically versus time-limited interviews is that we get every question answered. It's not a case of going through discussion guides and then running out of time to answer some questions. So every payer answers every question. And payer not under time pressure to answer them. They can take the time, they can reflect on it, they can consult with colleagues, they can do their own research, so they can give a more informed response by just being allowed more time as well.
Okay.
Hope that answers the question.
Yeah, great. All right. Our next question is from Jing. What data collaborations are important in the current environment? I think this one's for you, Preeti.
There are multiple data collaborations which are happening behind the scenes. Some of them actually Genesis Research is involved in. Again, depending on the disease state and the need for the life sciences companies, we oftentimes have to think through in terms of which data sources have to be integrated through those methodologies which are available to get disparate data sources together and answer the question holistically. We've had instances where registry data has been integrated with claims data. We have had instances where EMR data has been integrated with claims data. We've also leveraged unstructured data, which is available. So again, depends on what is the research question. We essentially try to understand what are the possibilities and then try to determine what integration needs to happen. But behind the scenes, many of the organizations, including Genesis Research, are working quite extensively in integrating data across multiple different sources.
Great response. Okay. Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. So this next one is from Stephanie. Sometimes payer/HTA decisions are made by taking into consideration clinical/KOL input. Can an online survey-based approach capture that element of interaction?
Okay, I think this is probably a question that's relevant both to Preeti and me, but given the online angle, maybe I can take this one. I think that's a good point that in most diseases, but in some maybe rare diseases specifically, that clinician input can be quite important and payers will rely on it. So in instances where we feel that is quite important, the way MIT approaches is we include both the KOLs in the sample so we can get that KOL voice and also compare the differences. Sometimes KOLs have more positive views on therapies and disagree with payers, and that is how it really goes out in life. So frequently we found that we do include KOL work in our surveys as well. But there are also instances where an area is completely new, and where we found approach works is to conduct surveys in a two-way approach. So first, looking at the KOL findings and also consider feeding or utilizing some of those KOL findings, let's say on a TP perception, value drivers perception, and presenting them to the payers as well so that they can respond to those and react and really imitate and emulate some of that real life discussion that also goes on. And I think one of the benefits of this approach is that rather than having few very strong voices dominate any discussions that can happen sometimes in the advisory board, we can still get everybody's voice heard quite strongly.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah, and I'll just add a little bit. Tiana answered it in a very robust way, but We always have the traditional approaches of ad boards and one-on-one discussions and diet interviews. All of those are available to us, right? So we have to use our judgment and our experience to understand. We may start from MAT RPR, and when it comes to refinement, that could potentially be done using the traditional approaches as well. So there is no one size fit all. You really have to understand what is needed and what would make sense from a strategic perspective.
Okay, thank you both so much. I think that will be the last question. So I just wanted to say thank you both for your time and expertise today. It was really a pleasure to have you with us, and I hope you had fun.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
And in closing, we hope you enjoyed this webinar sponsored by Genesis Research and that you enjoy the rest of your day.